So hi everyone, thank you for joining us today. My name is Pedro Brito, I'm the Associate Dean for Executive Education here at Nova SPE, and I'm very glad to host this webinar with an amazing title, Universities, the Netflix Moment. Honestly, at first I didn't get the idea, but when I read the description, it made a lot of sense. So the motto of the webinar is the following. So Friday night used to mean renting a movie at Blockbuster. But Netflix and others have changed that. As education faces its own Netflix moment, how can they avoid a Blockbuster fate? So having said that, I was personally very enthusiastic about the topic for natural reasons, but I hope everyone participates as well in the discussion today. So to do so, you can use the Zoom Q&A system during the webinar, and at the end, I will choose some of the questions. You can see the Q&A on your toolbar at the Zoom system. Please don't use the chat system for this purpose. If you have any problems, any technical problems, you can use the chat, but for popping some questions, please use the Q&A system. Just a final note before presenting our speaker. This webinar is part of the Role to Play initiative that we launched April this year. The Role to Play is a movement that aims to support people, organizations, and our community to face some of the consequences of this amazing, terrible but amazing paradigm shift with more and better knowledge. And that's the main purpose of that. So having said that, our invited speaker will share a perspective of what will change or what can change in the education arena. But I personally believe that the webinar will also offer an inspiration for other businesses as well. So let me quickly introduce Pedro Santa Clara. Pedro has been a professor of finance at Nova School of Business and Economics, also with an international academic career in the US, with a PhD in finance from INSEAD. He has published more than 30 papers in top academic journals of finance and economics with a strong research career. In 2013, Pedro's career took a radical turn, I would say, and over the next 6 years, he led the construction of our amazing campus at Carcavelos for Nova SPE. In this context, Pedro led the creation of Fundação Alfredo Souza, which he led between 2015 and 2018. And since the beginning of last year, Pedro started a company that promotes and manages social impact projects, and he is also partner of an asset management firm. A lot of things to do. So I know that Pedro has invited also a very special guest for this discussion that I will ask him to make the proper introductions. And having said that, please welcome Pedro Santa Clara. Thank you, Pedro.
Well, thank you, Pedro, for the introduction. It's a pleasure to be back to school. I've been on leave for 2.5 years now, and so it's a pleasure to come back to school to teach, even if in this new medium. And this is exactly what I want to talk about today. Universities around the world had to quickly adjust to this pandemic, and they moved their classes from the physical world to platforms like Zoom, like this one we're on now. And this actually happened fairly quickly, obviously with a lot of hassle, but it wasn't effectively a big technological change, moving classes from an amphitheater to a window, but I believe it broke a psychological barrier. It became acceptable to have classes online, whereas before online was seen as just good for second-rate education. And as Pedro said, I think this was the Netflix moment for universities. Just like 10 years ago, Blockbuster went bust, and we had countless movie theaters closed down, and the start of a giant crisis for traditional TV, from which it hasn't recovered since. I think these will mark the moment or the corresponding moment for universities. The point is that the quality of online education is already quite good. And I don't mean traditional classes over Zoom, but I mean education platforms of the likes of Harvard and Stanford, or even of new players like Hyper Island or the Power MBA, which already offer a lot of interaction and flexibility. They have high quality contents that are professionally produced by, if you want, movie directors. And these will, over the next few years, I think, become even better when you bring in enhanced reality, when you bring in ways of getting feedback from the students in terms of measuring the impact of education, how well they're learning and progressing with artificial intelligence and stuff like that. And I believe that pretty soon students around the world will really face the choice between going to traditional university, just like Nova, physically, or going to a top-ranked school like Harvard online. And when I say Harvard online, I mean what it will be in the future, and maybe it will even be a partnership with Facebook or Google or Microsoft, and any one of these tech giants, I think, have smelled the blood in the water and are itching to jump into the education sector, and these increased competition will drive many universities out of business, and only the universities that adapt, that are able to rethink very carefully their pedagogy and think really through how we learn, how we develop, only these will prosper in the next decade. Putting 300 students in an amphitheater to watch a professor, down in the bottom writing on the blackboard will no longer be acceptable, I believe. And I think there are 5 key points, 5 key factors of success for universities to prosper over the next decade. And it really doesn't matter whether it's online or on life, whether in all these cases you'll have to use technology to enhance the learning experience of students. The first factor is learning will have to be much more experiential and experimental. Most people don't really get motivated by a bunch of theoretical classes followed by an exam. What they really learn out of is when they have a problem to solve. And this is, in my experience, and I've been teaching for more than 30 years, is really what drives most students. The second key factor is learning will have to be personalized and self-paced. When you teach to a classroom full of students, you're really aiming at the middle, and you're boring some of the students who are faster learners and leaving behind many others. Now we actually have the tools to make the learning experience follow the pace set by each student. The third important aspect is that learning will have to be much more collaborative and creative. We need to understand that learning is deep down a social process. I think in many ways, this 10 years ago when we had a wave of MOOCs, the massive open online courses, we found that they essentially failed with dropout rates above 90%, and the reason was that they failed at interaction. Learning is not about watching a movie or watching a class over Zoom. Learning requires us to interact with our peers. You need colleagues and rivals, and it's like a set play, if you want. The fourth aspect that I think is really important is that education has to be much more accessible and inclusive. Too often in countries like Portugal, education is really is still very elitist and leaves out many talented people. We can't afford that. We really need to think carefully about how to make our formats of education more accessible to people. And the fifth aspect that I wanted to stress out is that learning must become a lifelong endeavor. Up to now we had this crazy idea that people go to university for 4 years to get an education, and then they start working until they retire, and then it's game over. Really, the future is going to be much more fast-paced, and we'll have to keep going back to learning. And perhaps the most important skill for the future that we'll learn at school is how to manage our own learning process, how to manage our education throughout our lives. Now, this is going to require quite dramatic change from universities. It's not going to be an easy process. It's not going to be pretty to watch. In many ways, governance at universities is not geared toward change. Often universities behave like a cooperative of teachers that are set in preserving the status quo. Even the regulation of universities basically forces them to keep the way of doing things, and makes it very, very hard to experiment and fail. And these are the key things, as we've seen in different industries that went through technological disruption. For survivability is really the ability to experiment. I want to turn to my guest today. David Giron is the head of École 42 in Amsterdam. And I wanted to bring these as an example because I've seen many universities around the world, and I've never seen a school like 42 that has really thought so thoughtfully, so deeply about how we learn, and has built a learning experience. This is a school actually that has no classes, no teachers, but rather has a pedagogical team that designs the path followed by students during their tenure at school to really maximize the outcomes. This school was started in Paris very recently, in 2013 only, and is already in more than 20 countries around the world. I think has been incredibly successful exactly because I think it has got pedagogy right. So, David, would you join me here? Thank you, and thank you for coming. Do you want to start by telling us a little bit about 42 and your experience in Amsterdam, and then I'll jump in and ask you more questions.
Yes, of course. Thank you very much first for having me today, Pedro. Hello to everyone. I don't know if it's a good morning, good afternoon, good evening, because with this online session, who knows? So my name is David Giron. As you can hear, I am French, but I also happen to be the director of Amsterdam's 42 school called CODAM. And before that, I was lucky to be part of the founding team of the 42 school in Paris back in 2013. And the idea behind this school was to try something completely new in terms of pedagogy. Instead of relying on the well-known scheme, let's say, of the teachers teaching to a classroom, something that has been there like forever. We wanted to shift the paradigm completely and try a real actual implementation of what's called peer learning. The idea is that the students themselves are going to be active in the way they learn instead of, let's say, waiting passively in the amphitheater that the teachers are going to push the knowledge towards them. So I know that's something that is discussed a lot, but the implementation of such a model has some radical implication on how the students will actually behave and learn in the school. First, there is one big shift, that's the idea that they are learning and there is no teaching involved, and that's actually quite a shift already in paradigm. The students will rely on each other to learn something, to reach a goal of knowledge by solving problems. For us, it's project, but it's because we are working with computer science, so it's solving a computer problem, but it could be any kind of problem anywhere. And the beauty of it is that the students are not really knowledgeable about that problem. They don't know how to solve it before, and there's no one who told them, okay, this is the solution, now try to implement it. No, they have to figure it out themselves. And that is absolutely brilliant, because that's a way for the students to actually acquire the knowledge and not just hear about the topic. We all have these students at the back of the amphitheater who don't really listen or pay attention, and that's a shame if you ask me. But with this model of the students learning with each other and solving a problem, you're sure that when the problem has been solved, they actually understood it because they had to fetch that knowledge. They had to actually implement the solution for it to work. So that's really something that I personally find brilliant, and that has been yielding some astounding results so far. But there is a bit more to that, and I think that's also why this model is so amazing. For me, one of the biggest problems with the teacher-based model is that the teacher is going to teach something that is specific in time. That's a topic, a class that is part of a context that is framed in time. And when you come to programming, for instance, because that's the field where I'm an expert, what we were teaching in university like 10 or 20 years ago is mostly irrelevant nowadays. And it will be even more irrelevant in 10 or 20 years from now. There's an analogy I use all the time, that's with the phones that we have in our pockets. Remember back in the 2000s, for instance, the phones we were using were something like the Nokia 3310 or so. That's insane when you think about it. Right now, we all have this beautiful smartphone. My point is that the students at the time were learning at university some programming, but dedicated to that kind of technology. Nowadays, the students are learning at the university all the technology and the stacks that are related to this piece of device. But what about in 20 years from now? Who can say what the phones will look like in 20 years from now, and what kind of technology and what kind of programming stack will be necessary to develop and program on these devices? I say no one can. The point of what I'm trying to say is that if no one can tell which kind of technology will be relevant by then I think it is pointless to try to teach these specific topics. Instead, what is relevant is to have the students learn to learn. And if you should remember one key idea that I'm going to tell today, it should be this very, very idea of learning to learn. Programming, computer science here is just an excuse. The very relevant thing is that thanks to this method of learning to learn, we are sure that the students will acquire the good habits, the actual work ethic to get to the information, to acquire the knowledge, and to be able to solve some challenges that are not there yet. I mean, in 20 years from now, it will be like the day we were at school. Okay, there's a new problem, a new technology. Where is the documentation? Where are the people relevant to that? And it doesn't matter if I learned about C++ or Java when I was at university. What matters at this very moment is I'm able to reach for the good ends, the good channels to eventually become able to solve this problem. So that is in a nutshell what 42 and the 42 network is trying to do, to try to have a paradigm shift in the way education is approached.
I can understand why you're so excited, and I am myself too. One aspect that I think is also quite relevant is these how this platform for learning is built, and how you allow people to pace themselves, to set their own pace of learning, how you incentivize people to collaborate with gamification tools, giving them points and badges and creating tribes and stuff like that. Do you want to just briefly tell us about that?
Yes, of course. So since we don't have any of the classic elements of a school, let's say we have no teacher, no classrooms, no semesters, no whatsoever. So what do we have? Well, instead we have one tool that we call the intranet. It's not fancy, but that's what it is, that will gather all the contents that are used by the students. So it can be obviously the projects, but it's also the means for them to actually engage with the school. So how does it work? Let's say, for instance, a team is working on a specific project and eventually they finish the project and they want to submit it. So there is a platform that relies on Git. They submit their project and then they have to have a grade for their work. And since we don't have any teacher or any assistant teacher staff, whatever, how could we assess the progress of our students? Well, for that, we use something that is perfectly classic in the academic world. That's the idea of peer reviewing. It's not the teacher who's going to look into the work of the students, that's going to be other students, So they will evaluate each other. That's the peer review, peer evaluation system. And we made sure that this is also fair, because since the students would evaluate each other, what would prevent them from giving the good grade or giving a bad grade because they don't like each other, something like that. Instead, the students, for instance, are going to be randomly selected, and then each project is going to be reviewed several times. So this will give us some incentive that the final grade is actually fair. But there's more to that. Let's say, for instance, that the project is failed. In regular education, failing is a bad news. That probably means you failed the exam, you have to wait for the next year, start over after that, or something like that. No. With us, we actually embrace the idea that failing is perfectly part of the process of learning. It's absolutely relevant and paramount that the students experience failing. So, if they fail a project, the only consequence is that they can start over and do better the next time. And that helps them to actually have this cycle of coming back to what they did, getting peer reviewed until eventually they can figure out what is the good thing. So, this, for instance, will give an incentive to the students that they have to work together, to collaborate, to count on each other. Even if it's a solo project, the fact that they will have to be peer reviewed force them to always engage with the community. But we went even further. Pedro mentioned that we have some gamification, and that's absolutely true. With a system that provides such freedom to the students, it's easy for them to stray away because there's too much freedom, a bit like the MOOC that Pedro mentioned earlier. So instead, we had some kind of safeguards around there that are pretty fun, actually, that make sure that the students stay engaged and play by the rules. So let's take a practical example. I mentioned a second ago about this peer evaluation. But that's something that is time consuming, and for the students who are a bit shy, maybe that can be a bit scary, so they might not want to engage with this evaluation. Well, we put in place some kind of currency that the students have to exchange in order to progress in the curriculum. If they want to get evaluated, they have to spend one of these points in this currency. If they evaluate someone, they earn of this currency. That means that in order to progress in the curriculum, they have to earn this currency. So that means they have to engage with evaluating some of the students. So that's one idea. But there is actually much more. The whole curriculum itself is heavily gamified. I don't know if you're familiar with role-playing games like, I don't know, Skyrim or Dungeons and Dragons. The idea is that the students have a player profile with an actual experience level. And instead of slaying monsters, they are actually going to slay projects and progress in the curriculum, earn experience points that are going to be distributed towards specific skills, and that will open and unblock some other parts of the curriculum, and so on and so on. The projects themselves are laid out as a graph, each node being a project, and the edges will form a path that will allow them to move towards that graph, that curriculum. And the fact is that they won't have all the same experience. There are some folks that are available there, and if you go left, you will learn maybe, I don't know, about a specific topic. If you go right, you will have another topic. But it's your choice, and it's always possible to backtrack and try something else. But the point is that you have the freedom to do that. and little cherry on top of the cake just to finish on the gamification part. Just for fun, we wanted to make sure that the community has some bounds that go beyond just the fact of working together on projects. So we drew inspiration from the famous Harry Potter, and we decided to include the houses inside the school. So each of the 42 schools have a set of 3 or 4 houses inside, and when the students join the school, they are assigned randomly to a house, and that gives them a bound that goes beyond the year they entered in the school and beyond the project that they are working on. So all in all, we made everything so the students will create bond, that they will collaborate, work together, and create a community, an actual community.
Well, thank you, David. Just one final question before we open for Q&A. I think 42 is as another aspect that's remarkable to me is the way it's an inclusive school, the way it's open to people from a variety of backgrounds, really just a meritocracy in the sense that, you know, if you're good in a broad sense, good not just in your own characteristics, but also in terms of being able to collaborate, to work together with others, you'll be selected. Just a quick word on that, and then we'll wrap it up.
Of course. So one of the core objectives is to make our education to the broadest audience possible. So for that, we had to make sure to lower as many barriers as possible between the young people and our education. First, the education is completely tuition free. So that doesn't mean that it is free, because obviously someone is paying for the education, but for the students themselves, they don't have to pay anything. Should it be before the education, during the education, or even after, as it is a bit trendy in the US right now? No, nothing. It is absolutely free. But if it is free, that doesn't mean that the student is the product. Actually, it is perfectly fair. The students are not tied or bound to anything. They don't have to work for a specific company for a certain period of time. They even own the code they write. We don't claim anything. If a student create a startup, a company, anything inside the school, they own it. We don't claim anything, and I think it's perfect like that. But there is even more. The only condition to access the school is actually to be 18, because we can't have underage students for legal reasons. But apart from that, there is no age limit. You can just join. If you're 45 or 50, you want to switch, please come in. You're welcome. So actually, there is nothing. You don't even need a diploma. You don't need experience, nothing. Just show up. But there is more to that, actually. In the computer science world, there is something that is sadly poorly famous. It does the gender balance is really poor. The situation, for instance, in France and in the Netherlands is very similar. We count barely 10% women in computer science, in ICT in general, as we say here. And honestly, that's a shame. There is no good reason to that. That's just a cultural bias that is a bullshit. I will tell it like I think it is. But it is also a reality. It leaves basically half of the potential talents out for no good reason. So we wanted to make sure that we could step in there. And at first, we were trying, like everyone tried, to identify and understand how we could do it the best. So we talked with people who know a bit about the question, obviously women, what would be the best. And eventually we came with a set of solutions that allowed us to move from barely 20% women engaging with our education to now almost 50-50. We are lately at 45% women engaging with our curriculum. That has been hard work. Obviously it's not done yet. We still have much work, but I'm really glad that we could achieve that, because for me that's a paramount goal. It means nothing to provide education if it is not available for everyone, and that everyone can access that in the fairest way.
Well, thank you, David, and thanks for sharing with us the experience of 42. I think this is a very interesting example of a radical new approach to the learning experience of students, one that I think undoubtedly should be considered by universities around the world who are thinking about how they're going to evolve their methods. This is not obviously suitable for everybody. I think there's room for many different approaches. As a final message, I think is really universities who want to do well over the next decade or so really have to think about their clients, the students, and how they learn, how they progress, how they evolve, how they change their lives. And this is ultimately what's going to decide the schools and the universities that do well and those that don't. So I'm going to turn over to Pedro. I think you have some questions that you want to ask us, and
Yeah, I
everybody.
have a couple of questions. I will start with a question that was made by one of the participants. So many schools struggle to be at the top of specific local and international rankings. So doesn't this approach limit somehow the ability to achieve this type of awards?
I'll take that one. Maybe I've done some work on that, and the answer is yes. Actually, I think there's going to be many barriers to evolution of schools and universities. One is accreditation. Most universities around the world are accredited by agencies. For instance, if you want to offer a degree in Portugal, there's this agency called A3ES that needs to give you an accreditation, and the criteria they use for that are basically things like how many professors per student do you have, how many classes of how many contact hours between faculty and students you have, and so on, and those indicators really just make sure that you follow exactly the same model as everybody else. The same applies for rankings and so on. All those tools, you can think of them as, in a way, protectionist tools that protect the incumbents in this industry, but at the same time they have a perverse effect in that they make it very difficult for universities to innovate, to try out. And this is why, ultimately, like in many other industries, it's often not the incumbents that prosper. It's often, second-tier participants. It's often new players that come into the industry that are not bound by those restrictions that end up doing well. I think that, coupled with the governance structure of many universities, which is in that I know this well, tends to be geared to preserving the status quo. And finally, one thing that I think is particularly important for Portuguese universities is the lack of resources. A lot of these new models of teaching will require important investments, and not all universities will have the means to do that.
Thank you, Pedro. And another question regarding the learn to learn that David was talking about. That's a very relevant and up-to-date question that everyone is making at this point, not only universities, but corporates. They're trying to change their competency model to a more learn-to-learn approach, but they're struggling to do so. So do you have any type of recommendation regarding the way both companies and universities can start a journey of introducing methodologies and approaches to a learn-to-learn culture in their organizations?
Yes, so my advice would be that the role of the teachers have to shift. Instead of being the holder of the knowledge that wants to transmit it to the students, they would have to be, let's say, the game master, sorry for the analogy, but the idea is that first you have to, if you want to transfer from a teaching model on a topic to a peer learning model, first you have to map the knowledge. You have to create a map of the knowledge you want to give to your students. So you have to break down all the logical unit into smaller and smaller units until you have this graph of knowledge, this map of the knowledge on the topic you want. You obviously have some areas that goes together and that you can identify some bits that work well together, and this could become a project that the students are going to work with, because a project is not just a problem to solve. For the students it is, but when you create the content, it's actually for you the media that you're going to use to have the students discover the knowledge you want. It's not just for the sake of solving a problem and finding a solution. No, there is something to learn with that. For instance, if I'm talking about, I don't know, programming and algorithmics, I want the students to learn about the sorting algorithms. So I'm going to wrap my project into something fancy that will encourage the students to learn to try to solve that problem because it's motivating. But beneath, what I want them to learn is sorting a collection of any kind. And that is very small at the beginning, and as you go further into the curriculum, you can assemble larger and larger bricks to make a project when you're always under control of what the students are going to learn with that project. That's one part. The second part is the evaluation part. I mentioned that the students are going to evaluate each other's, but there's actually a little bit more that I haven't mentioned. It's the evaluation scales that the students are going to use. These scales are provided by the staff and are an objective way to evaluate the quality of the work that the students have done. What we want to evaluate here is the problem solved? Of course, but also, did you learn what I wanted you to learn? And for that, you have to make sure that being successful with the project equals having learned what was there. So for that, you have to come up with some specific kind of tests, some specific kind of areas to focus on to make sure that the students learned about what you want them to learn. So it is actually a little bit of a trial and error at the beginning, especially when you start fresh. But after a few years, you start to notice patterns that work and you can reuse them from project to project, from evaluation to evaluations. And after a while, it starts to make sense. And then you have a string of projects that you can eventually arrange with like a graph, if you like, that will create a journey towards learning something. And then your role is to make sure that the students will stroll on that little journey and learn from it and not being actively teaching them.
Thank you, David. One last question from my side for the sake of time. What would be your advice for teachers that at this point work in a traditional school to amplify some of the best approaches that you have tested in your environment? What would be your advice to guarantee a much more interesting experimental approach of learning in the future?
So maybe I can start and then you jump in, David. I think schools really have to essentially change in the sense of the incentives they give to faculty, the way they really think about the learning experience. And this is tricky. It's like any change management process in an organization. You really have to think very carefully about the entire process and then create the rules and the incentives for people to contribute to that. And at the end of the day, there's always going to be some faculty that adjust better than others, just like in any other organization. And the role of leadership is to steer this process of change in the direction that you want, trying to nurture everybody to achieve what's desired in the end. David, maybe you want to add something specific about how you do it in 42.
So it's a bit difficult to give advice because I understand that everyone has their own experience and their own situation. So from my point of view, I would say that you have to really believe in that change because I experienced 3 steps. At first, when we said we wanted to do something like peer learning and so on, everyone was calling us genius. That's marvel. We should do that. That's brilliant. Then second step, when we actually want to implement it, oh my God, you're just a fool. It will never work. Why are you trying to change the system? We already did like that. What's wrong with you? And so on. That the moment when you say, well, why am I bothering even? No one wants that actually. They like the idea but not doing it. And then when you push through and you reach the third step, and then everyone start coming back saying, hey, actually it looks like it's working. I'm glad that you pulled through. So I'd say that the advice I would give you is try to do something, and if you feel like people are pushing back, that's probably a tell that you're on the right way.
Excellent. It seems quite good. I have my own motto, which is test and learn, even if you fail sometimes. So I think it's a very good message to evolve in the traditional school. So Pedro, David, thank you very much for your time, your inspiration. Just a quick reminder, the webinar is being recorded and will be available in the next couple of days if you want to review or share. Once again, thank you very much for your time. And for all participants, thank you again for following us on the Role to Play webinars. See you soon.
Thank you, Pedro. It was a pleasure.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you for having me. Goodbye.